dear Dr. Sabet. Thank you for joining me again.
Thank you.
Today,
Thank you for this opportunity as well.
today, at your encouragement, I will step out of my interviewer role and join the discussion on the challenges of higher education. First, I will briefly review the topics from our first video on the challenges of higher education. Then I will share the ideas I had originally prepared for that session. At the end of that, I will also quickly note a few areas where my perspective might differ or might accompany that of Dr. Sabet. After that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Sabet for his response, and we'll see how it goes from there. Dr. Sabet, thank you for your patience and being here.
Thank you.
If you watch the first video, the themes Dr. Sabet has selected are really about the fundamentals of higher education. First, he has outlined the history and the development of higher education, emphasizing the important role of religion in the formation of universities and the role of values from religion. This has also set up a main thesis that historically, universities have been endowed with a clear purpose, a unifying philosophy, and a set of moral values, but that this is no longer the case. In touching on the modern period, Dr. Sabet has highlighted key themes such as the integration of teaching and learning, institutional autonomy, academic freedom, widening access, digital technology and online education, and global rankings. So these are some of the challenges that also got mentioned. Then he has looked at three essential systems in our society: K-12 education, vocational and technical education, and higher education. He has argued each of them needs strengthening and reform, but that this should be done in coordination. Notice these are three issues of structure. After that, Dr. Sabet has turned to three issues that are conceptual in nature. At a time when the shared moral and cultural frameworks are in collapse, we return here to his main line of argument, universities have lost the unifying philosophy or purpose needed to respond. Therefore, the lack of moral and philosophical anchoring of the university renders it vulnerable to all sorts of challenges and unable to prevent further societal breakdown. Finally, Dr. Sabet outlines how the liberal arts and the social sciences might respond to this broader civilizational and cultural breakdown, ultimately proposing a new model for an interdisciplinary undergraduate program in the social sciences. Now, let me share some of my own views about existing challenges, after which, as I said, I will give the floor to Dr. Sabet. Broadly speaking, I am extremely positive and supportive of higher education. I think that at its very core, that is in the academic subjects, the system functions well enough for the time being. The academics are doing a sterling job, and with more autonomy or say in strategic matters, they would do much better. They are taking care of the engine or the heart of the university quite well, though some are burnt out in the process. A lot can be improved, yes, but even as things stand, institutions of higher education deliver exceptionally well. Also, they are maybe some of the best social spaces to be part of. Certainly my favorite social spaces and where you can have amazing self-development. Universities are also very complex institutions and are very often at the cutting edge of society. Other types of institutions with comparably as much complexity are probably the federal government or the United Nations system. The university has around 200, 300 specialties, a huge amount of internal diversity and difference to manage, and a different, more open-ended, exploratory mission to produce and safeguard knowledge and intellectual formation in an ever-changing environment. Even in the administrative side, the duty of care they are championing, though not without problems, is yet to be mirrored by the other main institutions of society responsible for the development of our youth. As Professor John Morgan, now at Cardiff University, often noted in discussing the university as a public good, the university functions as a microcosm of society. Universities serve both as laboratories for the future and as mirrors of the present. If universities are not democratic internally or in relationship to the state and the monopolies in the market, then we are not truly living in a democracy. If academic fields, especially in the humanities and social sciences, are not allowed to operate autonomously, they become vulnerable to distortion by external interests. In such conditions, knowledge risks being degraded or emptied of meaning, even as it is reshaped into a tool for social control. The most essential job of universities, in my view, is to preserve the organic, autonomous development of the academic disciplines. This is often forgotten. In the modern era, the entire structural and conceptual apparatus of universities has developed around these divisions of knowledge that are the specialties and the department. I'm drawing here on Burton Clark. Departments and their specialties function like the nucleus of an atom or the core structure. They are the core structure of the university. Each department forms its own distinct universe, even across different institutions, because it determines its own mix of faculty, areas of specialization, research priorities, philosophical orientation, and degree of engagement with other fields. These divisions, integrated into schools and faculties, are the lifeblood of the university, and in many ways of the nation itself. They cannot simply be reshaped from the outside to satisfy external agendas that are often competing, contradictory, constantly shifting, and frequently undermining one another. Yet current trends show that such attempts are becoming increasingly common. Knowledge, therefore, lives organically in the structures of the specialties and the department. Because of this, and because the discovery of knowledge is an open-ended task, the hierarchy of work arrangements has been, until the later part of the 20th century, unusual flat and loosely joined in the academic world. Again, citing Burton Clark. My argument here is that it should continue to be that way, though there is no return to the past. Now, let me highlight some specific challenges of higher education in England, which might have broader significance. This is what I'm more familiar with. Uh, Frankly, I can easily think of 100, maybe 200 challenges that need to be discussed in relationship to higher education. Each of them deserves to be highlighted here. Each is dear to me and equally important. But on this day, this is the order in which my intuition has brought them forward, possibly because some I wish to emphasize to the general public and others to university staff. The first challenge I want to mention, and this is purely for general context, is the massification of higher education. In the UK, Peter Scott has written two excellent books on this. This has been described by Martin Thoreau in the 1970s. He basically has described a historical shift from elite higher education, where the participation rate is between 0 and 15%, which had the purpose to educate a small social elite for leadership and cultural reproduction, to a system of mass higher education where the participation rate is between 15 and 50%. The aim of that is to advance training for a broader population and meet the needs of industrial and knowledge economies, especially in terms of trade and services. And there is also a universal higher education, which basically happens when the participation rate goes over 50%. And the purpose of that is to support lifelong learning, social inclusion, and the skills needed for complex post-industrial societies. As access expands, universities face new pressures, more diverse students, greater demand for resources, changing expectations, and shifts in their mission and structure. Today, countries like the US and the UK sit around 50 to 60% in terms of participation, while South Korea, Canada, and Japan have even higher rates. The massification of higher education opens up a huge number of challenges. I will only mention a few. Most obviously, a crisis in funding. So the funding model of higher education is a key challenge, which I won't be able to discuss. Another one is the fact that inequality persists in access after you expand, the system. And this shows by different social markers like nationality, social background, race, ethnicity, being a part-time learner or a mature student. And it shows both in access and sometimes in outcomes. There is there is a whole widening access and participation challenge to higher education that relates to that, and I might touch on it briefly, but I won't discuss it. And the third one is what I refer to as the economicization of higher education or the economization of higher education. And this is the second challenge I want to highlight in more detail. But in order to do that, I must first explain why this is my choice. While Dr. Sabet provided the cultural framework for understanding the transformations of higher education, I find it more useful, but not more important, just more useful to start with the economy, and in particular with the economy of the UK. In the modern liberal democratic state, the steering of all social systems is less through state ideology or a particular philosophy and more through institutional mechanisms, the most important of which is the economic system. This is up for debate, but it is an angle I take here. The higher education is thus part of the economic system and impacted by changes in the labor market, the housing market, the welfare and health systems, the system of taxes, and all sorts of other notions that relate to the economy, such as productivity, economic growth, interest rates, the business sector, national debt, the stock market, treasury yields, and so on. Let me explain why, therefore, a key focus on the economic context, why a key focus is the economic context for me and what issues it opens up. And I will speak just about the UK. The UK has been through a cycle of prolonged underinvestment, low productivity, and low growth. There is no housing for the youth because very little housing has been built over the last 30 years or so. Wages have also not increased in relationship to wealth. This means that the wages of those in work are stagnant or declining, while those with wealth, such as properties, have seen their wealth increase a lot. We are divided into rentiers and rentees, much like during feudalism, in a sense. In the UK, we have had flatlining wages for the past 15 years, and that's on the back of high inequality. As for the youth, pay for British graduates in the early 30s has remained 16% below 2007 levels, while non-graduates are down 6%. On the other hand, the number of those experiencing destitution, which is the most extreme form of material hardship, has doubled between 2017 and 2022 to 3.8 million people. Those who are young, disabled, or black are in the firing line, with those who are black 3 times more likely to face destitution than the population as a whole. In addition to this, almost no state support for the young exists in terms of benefits. The nature of jobs has also changed, with part-time jobs, agency and zero-hour contracts or precarity replacing employment. In the UK, 60% on zero-hour contracts are aged under 35. Add to this a taxation system that taxes higher tax rates on income rather than on wealth, and consider that the council tax operates with higher tax rates in poorer areas for any given band. And you can begin to see the big picture for the under 30s and the working class. To this, then, we must also add the demise in entry-level jobs in IT and many other fields due to the rise of AI. Just a few days ago, The Guardian has stated that as many as 46% of the 170,000 jobs lost from company payrolls since June last year are from those under the age of 25, the equivalent of more than 150 jobs lost per day. Long-term youth joblessness is also at a decade high. We also have a statistical category in international economics that counts young people not in education, employment, or training. These are usually adolescents plus 20 somethings. In the UK, this group of young people who are increasingly disengaged from not only the economy but the rest of society has doubled in just over a decade, from 4.5 to 9% of the population aged 20 to 24. Because they cannot earn enough to pay a mortgage, under 30s are living with their parents or crowded in shared housing like students do, or with students, paying more for housing each month than they would for a mortgage. Not surprisingly, if so many people are living with their parents and cannot pull together the funds needed to own a house as a couple, the fertility rate has also declined. Right now, this is beginning to have a massive impact on the economy, as too few people will be in work compared with those retired and in need of care and medical assistance. All of these features have also led to a huge polarization between the older and the younger generations, with amazing pensions and easily bought properties, which have grown exponentially in value for the older generations. And this is one of the main reasons for both the rise of alt-right or the far right and for some enthusiasm for socialism. These socioeconomic reasons are likely also responsible for the rise in anxiety and other mental health conditions in the youth. So the situation of the youth is clearly dire. It is in this context, and in one in which the government is not investing enough to create jobs, has no coherent industrial strategy, and is in policy chaos and constant reshuffling of leadership and departments, that universities get a lot of the blame for their degrees not leading directly to gainful employment and for the mental health of students. But how could they ensure these when those other key sectors like the labor market, housing, benefits and care, the tax system, immigration, public investment in education and in mental health services, social media and the government are themselves in crisis and an industrial strategy is missing? What emerges from this and from the massification of higher education is what some have referred to as the economicization of higher education. And this is the second challenge I want to highlight. The economicization of higher education is the process by which higher education becomes shaped primarily by economic objectives such as efficiency, competition, employability, revenue generation, and market performance, rather than by academic, social, or democratic values. This broader perspective or reality opens the door to many other challenges. One of them is the marketization of higher education. This has been covered very well by Susan Robertson and Janja Komljenovic in the UK. Marketization refers to the process of introducing market principles, mechanisms, and logics into areas of life or institutions that were previously organized around public, social, or non-market values. In other words, it is when sectors traditionally run for public goods, such as higher education, healthcare, welfare, or public services, begin to operate more like markets. This has led to increased competition between institutions. Think of marketing and market insights units. Quasi-markets for students. Think of the notion of student choice, tuition fees, rankings. Efficiency measures, performance indicators and metrics, or what is known as the audit culture. The increased causalization and precarity of academic staff, and the pressure to secure grants and produce measurable research outputs. And the commodification of education, meaning envisaging education as a product and the student as a consumer. Now, I want to just discuss a little bit the commodification of higher education very briefly. So, universities and schools design courses, degrees, and programs to be marketable to students. Universities compete like corporations. Rankings, marketing, recruitment campaigns, and product differentiation are important, as well as prestige, employability, and international partnerships. Education becomes valued primarily for its economic return rather than intrinsic or social benefits. Students' investment is justified by the expected return in the labor market or human capital. You can see how this last observation links to another direct consequence of the marketization and commodification of higher education, the decline or marginalization of disciplines seen as less economically productive. From this notion has resulted one of the biggest challenges to higher education in our cultures in general, namely the dismantling of the humanities departments and programs that is taking place everywhere in the United States and the United Kingdom at the moment, right now, as we speak. I should add a note here for those with a religious perspective. Within the modern structure of knowledge, the study of religion sits within the humanities. Yet when cuts are made to the humanities, religious departments, religious studies departments are often among the first to be reduced or eliminated. Supporting the humanities and thus the study of religion, I would then argue, is currently one of the most strategically beneficial actions that religious communities can take. Another consequence of the economicization of higher education is academic capitalism, by which I refer in part to the ways in which universities adjust their offer of academic programs or their processes in order to generate more profits from the student market. This often happens at the expense of key values and principles we commonly associate with higher education. I will give some very quick examples here. With minor adjustments, one degree can be repackaged as 3, 4, or 5 different degrees. Watered down, lower quality degrees can be sold or at least offered to the developing world at a cheaper price. Great inflation can take place. And the rise of essay services and plagiarism can be left unregulated at national level. For more on academic capitalism, you can see the books by Sheila Slaughter, Larry Leslie, and Gary Rhodes on this topic. Probably one of the most concerning tendencies at this point in time that relates to academic capitalism is that of drastically reducing the optional modules of academic programs and even some of their core or restrictive modules by introducing, well, through a lot of methods can be applied there, but one of them is by introducing a school or faculty-wide core curriculum or merging departments and programs. This occurs despite the ideology of student choice and optionality, which allegedly acts as the rationale for the reason to have markets in higher education. The economicization of higher education also has another very important consequence, not very acknowledged in higher education, but very real, in my view. No real institutional commitment to interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity, despite lip service. And that happens because it is too costly to set up, run, and administer in terms of quality of staff, course design, and especially administrative structure and how the administrative system would cope with that kind of complexity. Despite these claims to interdisciplinarity appear whenever departments are merged or disbanded or courses canceled and merged into one. Another problematic aspect is the unbundling of higher education, where essential aspects of what constitutes a university, such as teaching, assessment, curriculum design, student support, credentializing research, or campus services, are broken down into discrete components that can be outsourced and delivered by private providers, usually online, or sold separately, or these could also be sold separately by the university to increase profits. Michael Tomlinson and Maria Ivancheva have written about this in the UK, and I will not discuss that any further. I'm moving now to the third main challenge. After the massification of higher education and the economicization or marketization of higher education, we also have the financialization of higher education. These words are made up to twist my tongue. So the third challenge I wanted to cover was the financialization of higher education. This means that universities operate increasingly according to financial market values and strategies, and by relying on debt, credit ratings, and investment strategies through partnership with private financial actors like private equity firms, investment banks, and hedge funds. For example, universities take out large loans or issue bonds to build facilities, recruit students, or expand internationally. In order to service their debt, the sector is relying on the promise of future student numbers. In 2016, the Financial Times ran an article warning that huge debts were accumulating for universities who had taken loans or issued bonds to renovate campuses and building lecture theaters, laboratories, libraries, and halls of residence in order to attract international students. In 2018, the Financial Times reported that 16 universities like Swansea University were closing decades-long deals. Swansea had a 45-year deal with companies building student accommodation and with private equity firms. How did the Swansea University deal work? A private equity firm offered huge loans. A construction company would then build the student accommodation buildings and operate them for 45 years, receiving the accommodation fees from students. After 45 years, the buildings would return to the university, university ownership for free. In recent years, and especially during the COVID pandemic, it was revealed that many universities had locked themselves in terrible agreements of this kind on the presumption that their number of students will increase year after year and that month by month and week by week, each place in the student accommodation would be occupied by a tenant. The way the deal is constructed means that a considerable part, if not most of the debt, is structured in such a way that a certain weekly or monthly percentage of the debt incurred is given back to the investors through rents paid by student tenants. The construction company is usually primarily responsible for this, but the university is also liable, both in terms of having to cover for part of any cash flow shortfall from the accommodation fees, or even face penalties if weekly or monthly payments to the creditors cannot be met. And generally, because the overall debt it has acquired would have to be returned in full, maybe also with penalties, if and when it has been proven the conditions of the deal are not being met. So once you sign this deal, you must deliver a weekly or monthly percentage of debt from the accommodation fees. And if that doesn't happen, you will likely face strict penalties. And that just continues for 45 years. Tuition fees also get securitized. So it's not only accommodation fees, which means universities borrow money using projected tuition revenue as collateral. Instead of seeing tuition as payment from students to universities, financial markets treat it as a long-term revenue stream from which profit can be extracted. This is why tuition-dependent universities must keep enrollment and fee levels high. They have promised future income to financial markets. Because universities must meet the financial expectations of lenders or bondholders, they may raise tuition fees, raise student rents, increase enrollment aggressively, expand international recruitment, cut labor costs, for example by issuing precarious contracts, and close low revenue programs, or those that just don't attract enough students as compared to other very successful programs that also can impact the humanities. In short, the university becomes managed like a financial asset rather than as a public institution. In the Financial Times article from 2016, Professor Alison Wolfe from King's College makes the following comment. If the driving ethos, the thing which directs your behavior day on day, is maximizing your income, maximizing your position in the league tables in order to maximize your reputation and your fees, that means that you behave in a way that is very different from a traditional university where that wasn't the driving force. You do get the sense that if that is 90% of what is being thought about by central management, you are fundamentally changing the institution. For the people running it, it feels like a business. Through financialization and the mechanism of debt, the constant and progressive maximization of income becomes thus instilled in the essential long-term functioning of universities. But this does not happen just at the level of the university. The pressures of financialization are transmitted to the level of the faculty, then to that of the school, and finally to that of the department and each specific program. This is possible because of the progress enabled by digitalization. Digitalization has allowed for the collection and analysis of huge amounts of data about one's firm or public institution and their markets. This has rendered the invisible visible giving the appearance that everything at every level of an organization is measurable and therefore able to be computed in terms of financial value. Maximizing profits quickly then becomes the primary mode of evaluating the performance of any unit or department and of plans for reform. And in turn, this requires the corporatization of the department and school and faculty, meaning they start adopting the structures, priorities, and behaviors of a private firm, including profit maximization, efficiency metrics, competitive market strategies, branding and marketing, managerial control, performance indicators, revenue-driven decision-making, and cost-cutting. Budget savings soon come to mean cuts to levels of staffing and the hiring of short-term part-time staff on insecure contracts. I have covered the side of the challenges that relate to the economy, and I now want to move to digitalization and the rise of AI, and hopefully more faster. The first problem is that the first topic on the digitalization, and so this is a sub-challenge, let's say, is what I call the centralization of authority. The first problem is that digitalization enables decentralization of authority at unprecedented levels. Prior to the rise of digitalization, the information needed for decision-making was dispersed in many locations and areas of activity. Eliciting such information in the form of knowledge therefore required the participation of large numbers of people, directly or indirectly, in decision-making. Digitalization and technological solutionism, however, give the strong impression that these limits to information centralization and knowledge production have been surpassed, allowing those at the center to believe they can attain certainty and exert direct rule from distance. Brynjolfsson and Benzel have explained this as follows. The rise of AI, big data, and digital networks are challenging the twin facts that historically limited information centralization. Digital networks make it possible for detailed data, including the increasingly ubiquitous sensors that comprise the Internet of Things, to transfer information almost instantly and costlessly. Meanwhile, modern digital technologies, including AI systems and their cloud-connected embodiments, can continuously and cheaply upgrade their decision-making functionality, and by many metrics, already vastly exceed the computational power of the human brain. The digitization of information and decision-making capabilities can centralize information and, in turn, authority. Because digitalization gives the appearance that everything at every level of an organization is visible, measurable, and able to be computed in terms of financial value, this centralization of knowledge leads to the perception that decision-making can be completely determined from the center. The same advanced technological tools that make the centralization of information and authority possible also confer it secrecy. Decentralization of knowledge in this case implies a more total and inscrutable form of governance from distance. Something else happens here too. A new type of centralizing power or social control from distance emerges, which Manuel Castells calls programming the network. More flexible than vertically integrated hierarchies, but with patterns of interaction more stable than the market, the network is at the same time centralized and decentralized and able to display a variable geometry. However, informational networks operate on the basis of a common protocol and a shared set of goals, values, and codes that include valuation of performance and criteria for success or failure. While such a network can function in a decentralized manner as the result of the interaction of all its elements, the centralization of knowledge triggered by the digitalization of information allows those with influence over the network to redraw its protocols, goals, values, and rules of performance according to their own understanding, interests, and desires. This can apply to an institutional form, such as a university, and it can also apply to any other aspect of reality under the operation of that institutional form, such as the curriculum. This new modality of power is referred by Castells as programming the network. Governance in such a network occurs via a protocol or network program rather than through the visible direct actions of a single center of power, though the two can easily overlap. It is a feature of informational capitalism that organizations, therefore, seem to be more and more divided between programmers or decision makers, who are largely inaccessible and a network unto themselves, and implementers with different limited degrees of access to the actual network program. When programming the network combines the centralization of knowledge with the centralization of surveillance and that of authority, the likely outcome is the centralization of social design, which is to say that they really start shaping the social reality. This, an aspect of this can be seen in terms of the skills and the types of curricula that are built, um, and how they relate to skills and employability. I maybe want to make this much shorter, so I'm just going to say normally constructivism is the kind of the dominant espoused theory in the academia about curriculum change and how the discipline should develop, and so forth, or at least on terms of pedagogy and curriculum change. And this is often presented or understood to be the dominant view. However, if this is the theory that is widely discussed, the actual theory in use is a version of constructive alignment and outcome-based curricula, from which this sort of constructivism has been stripped away to be replaced with learning outcomes and skills representing the economic agendas of governments and businesses. You can also see that this has happened because, first I should explain, constructive alignment means that the module outcomes have to be aligned with the program outcomes, and both of them have to be aligned with the methods and forms of assessment. The idea of constructive alignment was to have this based on formative assessment so that learning is student-centered. However, government, state agencies, employers, and the university leadership have used this as a way to embed their particularly cherished skills or competencies into the curriculum. The university leadership has also used this strategy to steer staff, alter the curriculum, and reduce the number of optional modules. A consequence of this is that employability skills are suddenly more important than the theoretical content of the discipline, more important than intellectual and academic skills in curriculum development. This is an issue of balance that can be recalibrated, but until then, the issue remains problematic. Another problem that relates to this and to the programming the network is that government and edtech and the business sector are intervening and have actually succeeded in shaping the very language and concepts of education. Management language and business or state policy terminology mixed with edtech ideology, especially behaviorism, especially via learning analytics, have started to quite effectively replace the very discourse and discipline of education through dubious statistical, administrative, and learning analytics based concepts like student experience, student engagement, or learning gain. Government and edtech or business have so effectively intervened in shaping the very language and concepts of education that most administrators and academics, and sometimes even the educationalists themselves, tend to operate exclusively with such terms. This is a huge problem, inasmuch as real educational concepts that draw on philosophy of education, pedagogy, or curriculum development are left behind and outside the curriculum development processes of the university as a result. Finally, I should also say here that the centralization of authority happens not only because of digitalization, but is heavily accelerated uh, because of because of that. And one key issue, maybe at least in the UK, is that the governance structures of universities are very centralized. The government itself is a highly centralized organization, and then that transmits, it steers very strongly the higher education system, and then the higher education system itself has a governance. The typical governance of a British university is as follows: there is a vice chancellor, usually recruited from outside the university. There are university executive boards, which are which implement the university strategy, and they consist of the vice chancellor, deputy vice chancellor, registrar, and pro vice chancellors. There is a university council or board of governors, also recruited from outside the university. This is the main governing body. It ensures strategic direction, financial oversight, compliance, and usually includes external or lay members for independence. And then there is the Academic Senate, which is the highest academic authority, which oversees academic standards, curriculum assessments, research policy, and is made up of senior academics and elected staff and student representatives. The history of UK higher education is that really over the last few decades, and more so in the last few years with the rise of digitalization, the governing boards in conjunction with the vice chancellor and executive boards, usually the governing boards, but sometimes the executive boards, other times the vice chancellor in the past, have assumed dominant positions in determining academic policies of all sorts, with the Senate or academic board being cut out of the loop, which has resulted in what is known as central management, or the centralization of authority, knowledge, and social design through programming the network and audit culture, through programming the network and through the audit culture of the university. The Governance of British Higher Education is a book by Michael Shattuck and Aniko Horvath on this topic. It's quite recent and it's very, very relevant. I will very, very briefly touch on the issue of diversity and just explain something that might not exist in many other countries. The UK has a legislative act called the Equality Act 2010 from 2010, and this a portion of that act basically underpins or makes enforceable another piece of legislation which relates to public sector equality duty. This applies to public bodies like universities, local councils, NHS trusts, or government departments. And basically, in short, it basically requires that public bodies must publish equality objectives and report progress. And it must show data about the modes of employment, types of contracts, occupational distribution, levers, and so on. To summarize it, if you want to look at like data about inequality, social inequality, and this or discrimination, or by age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage, pregnancy, race, religion, sex, sexual orientation, and by all sorts of other criteria, anybody can go and look at either if you're interested in the student side, you can look at the student annual diversity data reports of universities. So you can choose whatever university you're interested in, and this is publicly available. You can download that and see how the students compare across all sorts of social markers, or you can do the same from the staff annual diversity data reports. For universities, you can also look at their access and participation plans, and many of them are really good. And you can see from that the issues that exist are being recognized. Although the problem is that there is a stagnation, very slow progress on delivering on the targets identified. I looked at staff annual diversity data reports for quite a number of universities. Granted, it was mostly top 100 universities and even top 25. And I was shocked by the fact that when you look at the data, I don't have a lot of time to explain. Well, when you look at the data, and for staff, which is so not for students, for staff, you can kind of see there something that mirrors the apartheid system, which differentiated between whites, Indian, Asians, coloreds, and blacks in a very hierarchical manner. it is more complex than that and really worth discussing. But I have very little time for this, except to say that this is how you look, or this is how you can see in a more objective way whether there is such a thing as discrimination or inequality or structural racism in a society. And we are lucky that the UK reports this data, so people can access it. Still doing well for time. So there are a few other issues that are largely unacknowledged even by academics. I'll run through them very, very quickly. First, as the rise of generative and agentic AI seems to indicate, the production of knowledge has shifted from the public to the private sphere due to the exorbitant costs of running large language modules and other forms of AI. What are universities to do if knowledge and knowledge production, and thus the reordering of society, are now in the hands of powerful private interests and more an inaccessible private good? Shoshana Zuboff has written about this. So this is one huge challenge, is knowledge is moving to the private domain. Second, what are the limits of the centralization of surveillance, knowledge, power, and social design in higher education when a company like Microsoft emerges as the preferred cloud infrastructure for almost the entire UK higher education sector, and also pretty much for the world of work at large, allowing it to reduplicate thousands of institutions in informational form and to extract business intelligence from all of them. Third, cloud platforms like Amazon, Apple, and many others have already become intellectual monopolies by using the data extracted to plan innovation networks, outsourcing knowledge modules to subordinate innovating companies, public research organizations, and research universities, while retaining most of the intellectual rents derived from the transmission of knowledge into intangible assets. In short, universities across the globe help innovation for which they are being subsidized by the state, but the patents get generally assigned to intellectual monopolies in rich countries. Another problem is what Janja Komljenovic has very well argued is a new trend called the assetization of higher education. This means that rather than just selling courses or services, universities are increasingly monetizing user data and digital products. In fact, the higher education sector resembles the Wild West, where every app, digital platform, or cloud platform involved with universities is gathering the digital data provided to them in order to sell it further or derive specific business insights. As Ben Williamson has shown, the UK government has in fact conditioned universities to use the same data reporting format, so the data from all of them could be collected in a national data pool for which access is being rented to tech companies for the mining of data. Private companies get to mine the data, but some of the data intelligence produced must be shared with the government. Ben Williamson calls this the hidden architecture of higher education, but the trend exists at national level in many other areas, inasmuch as national population has become a type of national asset that exists as a kind of property of the sovereign state and is made available to private firms to mine for both intelligence and profit. In the digital age, the power of the state relies on the capacity for global data extraction and on the capability to perform algorithmic calculations on the data collected from the population of other nations, in addition to that of one's own. Data colonialism, therefore, is very much an issue too. And data colonialism highlights the continuation of the predatory extractive practices of historical colonialism via the new powers conferred by computing in extracting and analyzing the data of other nations and their populations. I have covered the challenges I wanted to cover, and now I am going to comment a bit more on the first video. If you just give me a moment.
Sure.
First, about the moral order in higher education or the realm of values. Despite all that I have highlighted above and the fact that inequalities remain in relationship to class, race, and other social markers relative to access, continuation rates, and attainment, it is generally the case that students are unaffected by, or at least unaware of, these challenges, and that the education they receive is still of high quality at the level of content. Why is that? Mostly because the moral order is still there, I think, and because value criteria is still there. The moral order subsists, in my view, but it must engage the economic system and the forces this releases, which are vast in scale and which have captured the organizational culture of the university. Addressing the issue of addressing the issue of the long-term debt to private equity firms and the corporatization of the university and its units, returning oversight over academic affairs to the Senate, decentralizing functions, especially with regard to academic matters, administrative staff, and curriculum, to departments and schools. All of that could, I think, result in the moral order emerging more clearly. About a unifying philosophy, I'm only in favor of the necessity to increase interdisciplinarity and the integration of knowledge, and to try to find a unifying philosophy while strengthening our commitment to values. We should seek to reactivate the philosophical foundations of each academic discipline, as in many cases, such as that of education, these have been undermined. Moreover, I think Dr. Sabet has a good curriculum model and theory for the pursuit of an integrative approach, which could work even without a strong religious dimension. However, every philosophy and curriculum needs an institutional network to embed it. To have a unifying philosophy, especially at the level of culture or within a sector like higher education, was in considerable part achieved in the past through political control, whether religious or state-based. There is no time to discuss higher education and its relationship with the modern liberal state before and after the demise of state ideology. I just want to highlight that that mode of coordination for unifying state vision or a unifying philosophical outlook and culture that stretches from the function of governance across all sectors of society has largely dissipated. The Western state does not coordinate for moral principles or a philosophical vision or a state ideology, but primarily via the levers of a modern economic system, first nationally, then globally inserted. Through that system and through policy, the state controls all other social systems, and that also applies to the curriculum. On the other hand, the philosophy of education has lost its power, and curriculum development barely still exists as a discipline, mostly after national curriculum frameworks were introduced in schools. It seems to me, therefore, that the unifying philosophy could never really develop top-down in this context, but only bottom-up, if that is even possible considering the limitations. At the same and the same argument seems to me to apply to higher education. There is a terrible isomorphism in English higher education today, which means there is a high degree of structural similarity. Universities all look alike and do the same thing, some earlier, some later, but it almost looks like they are using a similar template. And that might be the effect of a strong centralized government in steering. In my view, each university should develop its own unifying philosophy and a portfolio of programs that reflects that philosophy, and then allow that to be manifested through innovative curricula at the level of departments and schools. Universities should be the sites of experimentation in the field of knowledge and curriculum building. Each university and each of its units should be distinguished from all others through this, their philosophy and specific curricula. This is how students should make their choice based on curricula, not based on campus attributes or employability skills and statistics. At least we could start from here, and then maybe some degree of higher unity could develop. Now, in relation to Baha'i philosophy and curriculum, or Baha'i-inspired philosophy and curriculum, or any other religious-inspired attempt, considering how all things operate, the only way to really develop that, in my view, is by creating Baha'i-inspired universities, the same way some famous Catholic and Jesuit universities exist today, and quite highly ranked in the global system of higher education. There's more I could say here, but I'm running out of time. So if you give me just a few more minutes.
Sure, of course.
About liberal arts, um, Dr. Sabet's presentation focused on liberal arts as a way to rebalance the philosophical foundation and moral purpose of the university and its curriculum, and as a way of providing a value-based foundation for science. Dr. Sabet has also called for a return to Bildung, or a humanistic formation for students, for widely adopting the Oxford or Cambridge model of academic tutorship, and for a focus on moral development rather than just on employability skills. I should just quickly mention the Oxford Cambridge model of academic tutorship. This relies typically on meetings that are weekly or bi-weekly, in which tutorials pair one or three students with a tutor or supervisor for direct, personalized intellectual engagement. It differs is very different from tutorship or tutorship in or tutoring in other universities. In terms of an ideal to aspire towards, I agree with all of the above notions of regarding the liberal arts. Your observation that currently liberal arts just looks like fragmented courses and modules is also very correct for the UK as well. It basically depends on the student and his supervisor to make a coherent program of study from what is available, and if they are very lucky, for those modules not to clash in the timetable. About indoctrination in higher education and rigid worldviews, suppressing alternative perspectives and debate, and the reduction of education to the uncritical transmission of ideologies, political, materialistic, or identity based, into the academia, and classrooms that are motivated towards advocacy rather than learning. On the one side, I I think here more about what Ronald Barnett calls pernicious ideologies, which are the list that he has is very similar to kind of what I've discussed. He refers to the entrepreneurial university, which at the time meant corporatization and financialization of the university, or marketization of higher education, which is what I've discussed. He refers to the ideology of quality assurance, which itself becomes the main driver of curriculum in key ways. Uh, and he refers to the economicization of higher education, or the political threat to academic freedom and scientific research in general. With all of those, I agree. I can also see why identity-based ideologies permeating the curriculum might, in some cases, lead to an excess of a kind or another. But overall, I'm not concerned about that. And I remember you distinctly mentioned an issue of balance, as in some of those subjects maybe should not be considered to represent an entire undergraduate course, and be retained mostly at master levels, because that would be too thin a foundation for learning. No, nevertheless, I'm not so concerned for a number of reasons, and you weren't very specific, so it's not very easy to like engage. But making some assumptions, or just saying where I stand is the best I can do. So I am thinking that a lot of these topics um, could be too challenging in some ways, but overall there is a purpose to them. Um, so it's hard again to say what you have discussed, but I can I can talk about things that I think are relevant. So I remember studying feminist theory and thinking realizing that for every theory that was made by a famous male scholar, there was a feminist second critique or theory which upgraded that in some interesting way. Carol Gilligan updating Freud and Kohlberg was quite an interesting example. In pedagogy, I once studied a lot of pedagogical. I was trying to map how many types of pedagogies existed. I was very silly. But one of the ones that really impressed me because I had no idea it even existed was queer pedagogical theories. The UK has recently closed the only BA in Black Studies in Europe, which is running at the Birmingham City University. And although that was a BA degree, that degree made a lot of sense for me for many reasons, because of the history of Birmingham, especially in Handsworth, and because of the great staff team they put together and the connections they had with the industry and the local community, and mostly because of other systemic issues on race within UK higher education, which would require more of a discussion. I also think that it is sometimes useful to try to think from outside the Western perspective or from outside Western civilization, which is arguably, is that even possible? That's a whole discussion to be had. Now, again, I don't know exactly what you were saying, and that's not supremely important for me to elucidate, but um, I am worried about certain things that might be happening in the United States, and I don't fully know the reality there. But it does seem like social sciences and the humanities are going through a lot of funding cuts, and there's a lot of interference maybe in curriculum and research topics, and efforts to reshape funding institutions and other cultural institutions. And so I think uh, maybe some of these issues, or how should I say this? Maybe some of these disciplines and topics that I've just mentioned are facing a very hard time as already things stand. So so that's what I want to say there. On the bloating in the social sciences, I haven't seen that here, and I would be surprised if that was there as well. But I don't know. And the United States higher education system is very large, very it has many more elements. However, considering the loss of international students, which I think dropped by 17% this autumn, and the amounts of cuts to grants and changes in terms of the funding bodies that exist and other policies, it's really hard for me to not think that there are a lot of programs being closed down and everything is streamlined as much as possible, and that really this is probably one of the worst times in terms of academic jobs in the United States, and in terms of retaining academic programs and maybe even departments or entire schools. So I think that is that it's hard basically to it was hard to interpret maybe your comments in terms of the historical circumstances in the past few years. If those comments would have been earlier than that, I would have like maybe been less puzzled. But in the current context, I didn't quite understand. But I possibly have misread you as well. All in all, that's all I wanted to say. This is not the key element of everything you have discussed. It was just a kind of footnote, an important one, but just a part of the overall vision you had. So I'm not particularly keen to just go on that discussion. I am really, really, in a sense, very keen to discuss the notion of a unifying philosophy and how it could show or appear in the higher education system. And with that, I am done, and I fully turn to you, Dr. Sabet. Thank you so much for your patience, and I apologize if anything was unclear. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for for excellent synopsis of my presentation and your sharp insights and observations, and also for the eye-opening information and and materials about the British higher education system. And I knew that you were working on papers on the role of digitalization and economy in higher education, and I'm looking forward to seeing that published as soon as possible. You are really an excellent individual with highly sophisticated theoretical perspective of education, higher education, and social theory. So, and also I appreciate providing this opportunity for me to discuss some of my thoughts and ideas. And you mentioned some of the challenges that I also mentioned that higher education has, like, the issue of division of knowledge, or issues related to pedagogy and specialization versus general education, unifying philosophy for education and curriculum, and in general, the purpose of education and society, which are really intertwined. And so, to generally, let me summarize it in this way, that we are, even on those areas that we may look at the issue differently. I think there is an issue of dichotomy. In other words, you see one side, I see the another side. So that's how I can summarize it. You see economy, I see culture, for instance. You see liquidation of modernity. I see modernity as a civilizational stage moving forwards towards the higher stage, and so on. So I thought I say a few words briefly about some fundamental issues, at least the way that I see it, that are discussed seriously in today's society, in Western societies in general, and its impact, their impact on higher education. So my response is that in a few words, I just want to focus on, instead of stating my your comments, and also what we discussed previously, and your comments in the last section of the previous presentation. So I don't want to go into the context of higher education operation, but instead, I would like to focus on some conceptual and contextual frameworks within which these challenges, both societal and higher education, are facing. So the first thing that I thought, maybe I share my understanding and my belief system, and I know there are, many people disagree with this, which is fine. That's how in a democratic system, people express their ideas. The first thing that came to my mind was the concept of capitalism. What is capitalism? Because you mentioned that many times, and of course it is now, when you listen to the news, it's all over. So I thought maybe if I express my thoughts about capitalism, then it would open up more discussion, or more or precise discussion. The way that I see it is that the roots of capitalism lie deep in the basic human impulses such as individual ownership, personal initiative, and the desire to improve one's material condition. And even long before modern capitalism, before it becoming a formal economic system, human beings lived by working for themselves, cultivating land, producing goods, trading surplus, and trying to seek better opportunities for themselves and their families. So this pattern is really intertwined into human nature. That's what I'm trying to mention. People care more when they own or create and oversee something, and they are motivated to work harder and innovate when they directly benefit from their labor. So that is my perspective of the core of capitalist thinking. So in this sense, capitalism did not appear as an artificial construct at certain period in history or imposed upon society. I think it emerged organically as the institutionalization of human drives and human impulses. What impulses? Such as, ambition, reciprocity, individual responsibility, and pursuit of prosperity. So modern capitalism just tried to institutionalize these impulses. So far from being a historical anomaly or oddity, I think capitalism represents the normal and enduring way humans have organized material life. So because capitalism channels these impulses, this inclination, so it is really, it has become a standard and adaptive framework for structuring economic structure or economic system or economic relationships. Its capacity to harness efforts, reward individual initiatives, create wealth, and so on. These have sustained much of contemporary or modern material progress. So the problems associated with capitalism or being associated with capitalism these days, such as exploitation, inequality, instability, and so on, they have arisen not from the essence of the system. That's how I see it, but from failures in terms of power imbalances, in terms of cultural distortion, and basically instability that sometimes comes with any larger scale human enterprise. So these excesses can and should be corrected, definitely, but they do not negate the underlying alignment between capitalism and the psychological tendencies that make cooperative economic life possible. So it is within this broader historical and in fact anthropological context that Marxism, for example, must be understood. So in my understanding, for Marxism, for instance, which basically introduced the strongest critique of capitalism, far from offering a stable or empirically grounded design of economic life, it functioned primarily as a cultural and moral revolt against the injustices of industrial capitalism. More profoundly, it operated as a kind of secularized characterization of salvation, a grand narrative that promises an overall historical removal or overcoming historical contradictions, or abolish or eliminate suffering, and achieve a final state of human unity and universality. So Marxism's dialectical thinking is like almost a prophecy expressed in materialistic terms, and echoed the structure of almost a religious eschatology. That is, humanity would pass through trials, purify itself through struggles, and ultimately enters a redeemed stage of history. this vision rested on deeply subjective, idealized, and moralized expectations of human behavior, assuming that when or once class antagonism disappears, individuals would naturally act for the collective good and become free from selfish impulses. So in this light, Marxism was less a practical system of economic organization and more a cultural or even a spiritual reaction to the traumas of early modernity, attempting to provide or supply the material progress that had not been delivered, such as, in other words, the capitalism or material development or technology or scientific improvements had not been able to deliver. And those were like meanings, values, harmony, moral purpose. But because it demanded a transformation of human nature itself, basically suppressing individual incentives and subordinating personal initiative to collective ideals. That's what basically happened in the way that the Marxism was practiced, and we saw the outcome. So it ultimately proved impossible to sustain, to be sustainable in practice. So Marxism or Marxism power, in fact, was in its moral critique and utopian longing, not in its economic realism. It wasn't really economic realism. It aspired to be a theory of liberation, but functioned in many ways as a kind of theology of history, promising redemption through revolution and all that. So along with that, I just wanted to going back to the roots of capitalism or modern capitalism, and just say a few words about Adam Smith, the founder of, famously labeled as the founder of capitalism, and the concept of enlightened self-interest and invisible hand. So Adam Smith argues that individuals pursuing their own material betterment or their self-interest unintentionally promote the public good, and they do it more effectively than if they had consciously tried to do so. This is famously captured as he said, I'm just paraphrasing, that it is not from the benevolence of the butcher or the baker that we have our own dinner, but from their regard for their own interest. And then that brings him to the concept of the invisible hand. The invisible hand is the metaphor for the societal benefit that arises as an unintended consequence of individuals competing and cooperating in a free market. This mechanism basically relies on the idea that in a competitive environment, to profit, the butcher must offer good meat at a fair price and then benefiting the outcome or the customer. Also, Smith's concept of self-interest is generally not an endorsement of pure selfishness, as some people have pursued, or greed. In fact, it is a rational or enlightened self-interest, which he assumes operates within a societal framework for justice, for law and order, and so on. Interestingly, many people may not know that Adam Smith wrote two books. wealth of nations, on economy, and then the theory of moral sentiment. And these two must be viewed complementary. So according to the theory of moral sentiment, he viewed, his work as a coherent project, that moral sentiment explains how people behave in the personal face-to-face world of morals, and wealth of nations explains how people behave in the impersonal world of the market. And but both of these are linked by humanity's need for self-interest and social approval. So for a long period of time, scholars or writers basically debated this so-called Adam Smith's problem, that is the apparent contradiction between the sympathy of the moral sentiment and the self-interest of the wealth of nations. However, we have come to realize and better understand that and largely agree with this, that there is no contradiction. The two books, the two sentiments describe the same human who is both self-interested and morally just or constrained. And Adam Smith was particularly influenced by the critique of commercial society offered by Jean-Jacques Rousseau and many others, and he realized the potential for wealth and inequality to corrupt the soul and lead to superficial social environment. So he was really aware of the moral pitfalls inherent in the system he promoted. The other subject that I thought is very relevant, and you mentioned that very nicely in your last statements, and that is the concept of modernity. So I just wanted to share some general ideas about my understanding of the concept of modernity. I see modernity as in one phrase, if I want to summarize it in one phrase, as the march of human spirit towards civilizational renewal. That is the way I approach modernity in its general sense, and also the way that it is, in terms of geography, in terms of historical analysis, and its association with Europe and Western culture. So from a broad civilizational perspective, modernity can be understood as part of the ongoing movement of a global civilization. That's how I see it. Although, as I said, its modern shape was in Europe, took place in Europe, at a deeper level, my understanding is that it emerged from cumulative experiences of material and cultural exchanges among diverse civilizations throughout history. And so in that sense is one expression of these vast cultural, historical interchanges. So misunderstanding about modernity often arise when it is imagined as a purely Western European movement, a phenomenon that began at a specific moment, became fixed within a particular context or geography, and remained static after that. That is not true, I mean, in the way that I understand it. An equally mistaken assumption is also that it benefits only or benefits just went to for Western civilization, but that is not the fact. The benefits of modernity was not exclusively to the West, and basically it became just, it benefits went all over the world. I see that the way that we are now communicating, this technology, this everything that we have now in terms of material progress and even cultures becoming closer to each other and all that are the outcome of the scientific developments, and that was provided as a result of modernity or modern movements in the past 400 to 500 years and so on. And so we can talk about that for hours, about the impact of this on global modernization. So therefore, I see modernity as a living, organic, and evolving movement. Evolving is really the key. And this took place within larger process of humanity's civilizational growth. It has drawn nourishment from, as I said, different cultures, different civilization, from different religious traditions of the East and West, like let's say Persian, Islamic, Hebrew, Christian, Greek, and so on, Chinese. And like every living phenomenon, it is subject to differentiation and transformation. So this movement has a past, has a present, and a future. So I'm talking about modernity. So its past is rooted in all civilizations, and its future is toward unity of humankind and global interconnection. So I would like to really portray modernity in this context, not just as a historical with contextualization of a period, of a geography, and of a place, or a single episode. So I see it as a part of humanity's collective civilizational process, and therefore it can neither be regarded as the source of all virtues nor blamed as the origin of all ills. It is a dynamic phenomenon in continuous motion and transformation. So I see a lot of criticism, strong criticism, justly or unjustly, of modernity, is as if it's a saint, it's a divine revelation. No, it is a dynamic phenomenon, and it's continuously in motion and transformation. It emerged at a specific stage in history and had, all rise and falls in civilizational relationship, and it is moving forward. So in that sense, modernity is not or was not the final word in humanity's intellectual, political, social, or cultural evolution. So it must undergo transformation in accordance with the forces of civilization and moving forward. So when we define this in a literal or limited sense, then we cannot really, in my understanding, have a good understanding and appreciation of modernity. The other thing is features of modernity, such as democracy, for instance. We have to, in a really comprehensive discourse, we have to really define democracy as an outcome of modernity, and then define democracy, and then put democracy in different contexts. And as I said, in this civilizational progress. And also I mentioned that about the, a civilization, a universal civilization, and that critical perspective of modernity, or its limits basically cries for a broader perspective, for a broader spiritual and ethical framework, for all of these profound changes. So these critiques of modern times highlight the necessity of ascending to a higher stage of civilization, one that integrates the achievement of modern age while correcting its imbalances. So we don't have to look at modernity as a static phenomenon, but as a stage for ascending to a higher level, instead of degrading it, instead of uh, dismissing it as something of just did nothing but colonialization of the world. Then we really leave no space or no platform to move forward. So, because social developments such as democracy, liberty, the abolition of slavery, um, elimination of discrimination, advancement of women, economic justice, universal education, and are all manifestations of this civilizational progress. Some of them associated with modernity, but modernity as a progressive concept. So therefore, I suggest that we look at liberty, the abolition of slavery and democracy and so on, as achievements that belong to a global civilization, to a universal civilization. And this universal civilization will define the foundation of humanity's future discourse. It may sound too idealistic, too abstract, but I really feel that if we investigate more deeply, even in everyday experiences or general turmoil of the world, we can see elements of this progress. You mentioned, I'm sure, I try to be limited in my comments, but because you mentioned about the liquidity of modernity, I would like to say a few words about that. The concept of liquidity of modernity uh, is in modern life is defined by flux, by instability, and dissolution of a stable social structure, and so on. So in this interpretation, they are associated with certain left-leaning critique of capitalism. Modernity is not a constructive epoch, but a condition in which solid institutions disappear, melt, and identities become fluid. Commitments are weakened, and societies lose the normative anchor for their and coherence for the everyday life. So viewed within this lens, the modern world is a landscape of constant disruption, technological acceleration, shifting labor markets, fragmenting communities, and collapsing meta-narratives. So the liquidity emphasizes breakdown rather than renewal, arguing that modernity represents a crisis of meaning or a chronic condition of uncertainty. But the way that we need to redefine modernity basically is a positive response to that, in a sense that interpreting modernity as a chapter in civilizational renewal. So in that sense, it highlights the deep long-term processes through which societies reinvent themselves in response to accumulated contradictions. So I had some more itemized topics, but I move on um, and say that basically the key distinction between these two concepts, the liquidity of narrative, it sees modernity chiefly as dissolution of instability, a condition to be, diagnosed and perhaps therapeutically or lamenting way try to find a therapeutic approach. However, the civilizational renewal narrative sees modernity as a transformative chapter, full of tension, uncertainty, but ultimately part of the evolutionary rhythm of human progress. So the liquidity narrative stresses the loss of coherence, while the renewal narrative emphasizes the possibility of higher coherence that has not yet been achieved. And just a few other remarks about the issue of cultural breakdown, which was really the core of this argument, and basically the tension between societal dysfunction and whether it is by material impulses or cultural breakdown. It goes back to the beginning of time, the beginning of philosophy, and basically in every discourse on subjectivity versus objectivity, between science and religion, between internal and external factors. This discussion is about that. So my point is that societal dysfunction originates most fundamentally in the erosion of shared meaning, values, and all that. And when a society possesses a coherent narrative capable of orienting or reorienting its members towards a common purpose, then it becomes polarized, and the economic system lose their ethical foundation. So in that sense, culture in its deepest sense provides the interpretive framework through which individuals understand their responsibility to one another. And I would like to say that this is where the idea of Zeitgeist, or the spirit of the age, becomes essential in this discussion of culture and material. Because Zeitgeist is not an abstraction, in fact. It is the living pattern of assumptions, norms, and values that silently organize social life. And when this spirit becomes fragmented, cynical, or nihilistic, everything built upon it becomes unstable. Even strong economic or technological systems cannot basically compensate for the absence of zeitgeist or shared meanings. So without this unifying cultural horizon, institutions basically devolve into competing interests, and public life becomes chaotic. And my point is that it is crucial to understand how cultural breakdown precedes and precipitates dysfunction in politics, in economics, and even technological life. It's not vice versa. It is not technology or economics or politics that shape cultural breakdown or resulting. It's from the other side. So economic corruption, reckless behavior, economic behavior, and consumerism, excesses of consumerism emerge when societies abandon moral norms and governing fairness, moderation, responsibility, and so on. So in this sense, in economics, politics, and technology are symptoms, not causes. That's my understanding. That's how I interpret it. Their root lies in a deeper moral and cultural disintegration that dissolves the bonds of solidarity and weakens social cohesion. And then, of course, we can go into more details about how in the various philosophical traditions, beginning with German idealism of Johann Herder and Hegel, Immanuel Hegel. Basically, they grounded social life in the shared language, stories, customs, and values that give people um, their culture, their character. And for them, these cultural elements were essential. Uh, Hegel extended this insight to describing history. It's very interesting. History is the unfolding of Geist, that is the spirit of people expressed in its cultural consciousness. So, on this view, political and economic forms do not create culture. Rather, they are expressions of an underlying cultural worldview that people and historical development are based. A strong emphasis appears in Kantian tradition about this, and then of course um, in the same emphasis or this emphasis on value and meanings reappears in the classical sociological traditions of Emil Durkheim, who argued that society is fundamentally held together by its collective consciousness, shared symbols and rituals. And Max Weber, social theory reinforces this cultural uh, primacy by showing that ideas, beliefs, and worldviews precede and shape economic arrangement. So Weber's analysis of the Protestant ethics, for example, demonstrates that modern capitalism was not merely a material development, but the outgrowth of a particular religious moral culture. Even neo-Marxist thinkers like Gramsci and people in the Frankfurt School of Marxism or critical theory, they shifted the attention from economics to the cultural sphere, and that's the reason they were successful in European universities and American universities, because they by eliminating that element and coming to the realm of culture, sometimes unsuccessfully, but overall by mixing Marxism in the cultural context, then they allowed its continuity and reinterpretation of their ideas. I just want to stop here. I had more to say, but I really enjoyed this additional discussion that we had about higher education, and I heard your comments.
Thank you so much. I I wanted to just say it is very hard to keep up with you.
You are welcome.
Yeah, you would be a challenge for anybody that is specialized in higher education. Um,
Thank you
and
so
and
much.
and and I also wanted to say you are a system builder in a way, and a type of intellectual that is hard to find now, and there is a lot to learn from someone that has developed a coherent, unified perspective, which operates as a sort of unified whole that just you build on continuously. And also, I wanted to appreciate the fact that you are so honest and openly sharing your vision, which I think is a lot more complex than you have outlined, and it will take time to fully describe. But I think the two interviews show interesting perspectives that are different in some key aspects, and I think that is to the benefit of everyone. And I also think that there is so much to learn from testing yourself against someone like you who is a system builder in terms of ideas. So even though you might be arguing about an idea in one place, engaging with you forces one to engage with the way all different key major ideas connect. and that just forces you outside typical intellectual formation in the universities right now, which is so specialized. So there's a lot to find in what you say to both motivate you and challenge you, and also provide an example. And not everything is very necessarily extremely clear about where both of us are situated on so many topics, and that is, that will take more time to figure out. uh, you are more clear with yourself about where you sit. I am less clear about myself. I change a lot also. So that's a different thing. But overall, I don't want to keep you more. I just wanted to thank you for this, and thank you for your patience, and for engaging, and for the brilliant comments at the end. And yeah, that you know, I
Thank
don't
you very
know. I don't
much.
know what the next session or what will happen next, because everything has been very, very unpredictable.
Oh,
Thank you.
definitely. But I'm looking forward to another opportunity sometime in the future about all of these topics. There is a wealth of uh, issues and concepts and developments, and that could be discussed, different narratives analyzed. So looking forward to another opportunity to continue this. Thank you for initiating this.
Likewise.
Bye.
Thank you.